The Johnson family was one of the wealthiest in the city. Their mansion stood like a palace, towering over the neighborhood with its tall iron gates, shining marble floors and golden chandeliers. They had everything: expensive cars, private chefs, and a long list of servants who worked tirelessly to keep their home spotless. But despite all their riches, the Johnsons had no kindness in their hearts. Jenna was one of the maids in their mansion. Unlike the others, she wasn't just any maid, she was the hardest worker among them. Even the head maid, Mrs. Wilson, depended on her more than the rest. Jenna did everything: scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and preparing the Johnsons' rooms before they woke up. She never complained, even when her back ached or when her hands bled from washing too many dishes. Jenna wasn't born into wealth like the Johnsons. She had been an orphan for as long as she could remember. Her parents had died when she was just a little girl, and with no family to take her in, she had grown up in an orphanage. Life had never been easy, but at least back then she had a place to sleep and food to eat. Working for the Johnsons was different. She had no one to protect her from their cruelty. The Johnsons treated their maids like they were invisible. Mrs. Johnson, a woman who only cared about jewelry and gossip, never spoke to them unless she was shouting orders. Mr. Johnson barely noticed them at all. But the worst of them was Toby Johnson, the only son and heir to their fortune. Toby was young, arrogant, and used to getting whatever he wanted. He had never worked a day in his life, and he looked at people like Jenna as if they were toys for his amusement. From the moment he first noticed her, he would find ways to make her uncomfortable. At first it was just lingering stares. Then he started making excuses to call her into his room, asking her to bring things he didn't even need. Sometimes when no one was around, he would try to touch her arm or get too close. Jenna hated it. She felt trapped, but she didn't know what to do. She tried to avoid him as much as possible, always making sure there was another maid nearby when she worked in the main house. But Toby was persistent. He knew Jenna had nowhere else to go. She was just a poor maid, and in his mind that meant she had no power to refuse him. Mrs. Wilson, the head maid, had warned Jenna before. "Be careful around him, Jenna. He's trouble. But whatever happens, don't fight back. If you do, the Johnsons will never take your side." Jenna knew Mrs. Wilson was right. The Johnsons didn't care about their servants. If Toby ever did something terrible to her, she doubted anyone would listen. But then one day everything changed. It was a quiet afternoon in the mansion. Mrs. Johnson had gone shopping and Mr. Johnson was at a business meeting. The other maids were busy with their chores, and Jenna was folding fresh laundry in one of the guest rooms when she heard a sound behind her. She turned, and there stood Toby. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest. She took a step back, but the room was small and Toby blocked the only way out. "Why do you keep running from me, Jenna?" Toby asked, his voice smooth but dangerous. Jenna clenched her fists. "Please let me do my work." Toby smirked and took a step closer. "Come on, don't be shy. No one's here. You belong to this house, don't you?" Fear gripped Jenna's heart. She knew what he was trying to do, and this time there was no escape. Her mind raced. If she let him do whatever he wanted, she would lose her dignity forever. If she fought back, she might lose everything. Toby reached out to grab her wrist, but before he could, Jenna acted on instinct. She grabbed the laundry basket and swung it at him with all her strength. It hit Toby square in the chest, knocking him back a few steps. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Jenna didn't wait. She ran. She sprinted through the hallways, her heart racing as she reached the grand staircase. She could hear Toby yelling behind her, calling her names, threatening her. But she didn't stop until she reached the servants' quarters. Mrs. Wilson was there, and so were the other maids. Jenna was panting, trying to catch her breath, but before she could explain, Toby stormed in. "She attacked me," Toby shouted. "This filthy maid dared to hit me. She should be punished." Jenna shook her head. "I was just protecting myself." Silence. A cold, sharp voice cut through the room. It was Mrs. Johnson. She had just returned from shopping, and behind her stood Mr. Johnson, his face dark with anger. "How dare you lay a hand on my son?" Mrs. Johnson's voice was venomous. "You ungrateful wretch." Jenna's chest tightened. "I didn't do anything wrong." "I don't care what you say," Mrs. Johnson interrupted. "You are nothing but a maid, and you dared to defy my son?" Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his voice heavy with authority. "Pack your things and get out." Jenna froze. "Sir, please, You have 5 minutes. His voice was final. Tears filled Jenna's eyes. She turned to Mrs. Wilson, the one person who had always been kind to her, but the older woman looked away, unable to help. Within minutes, Jenna was dragged to the front gates. They didn't even let her take her small savings or her belongings. They took everything from her, her clothes, her shoes, even the tiny necklace her mother had given her before she died. Then without another word they threw her out into the cold streets. As the gates slammed shut behind her, Jenna felt completely alone. She had nowhere to go. No money. No family. And no idea what to do next. She turned and walked into the unknown, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a broken heart. Jenna stood outside the grand gates of the Johnson mansion, staring at the world beyond. The air was cold and the streets were unfamiliar. She had never been outside without purpose, always going to the market or running errands for the Johnsons. But now she had no destination. She clutched her arms around herself, shivering. She had no money, no family, and nowhere to go. For the first time in her life she truly felt lost. Jenna walked aimlessly down the street, her bare feet aching against the rough pavement. People passed her by, barely sparing her a glance. She wanted to ask for help, but how? Who would listen to a girl wearing a torn maid's uniform with nothing to her name? As the day passed, hunger clawed at her stomach. She hadn't eaten since morning and now the pain was unbearable. She saw a small bakery on the corner, the scent of fresh bread filling the air. Her mouth watered as she watched a man walk out with a bag of warm pastries. She hesitated before stepping forward. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. I haven't eaten all day. Could you spare some food?" The man frowned, his eyes raking over her appearance. He clutched his bag tighter and took a step back. "Get a job like everyone else," he muttered before walking away. Jenna's heart sank. She turned and continued down the street, fighting back tears. Night fell and Jenna had nowhere to sleep. She wandered into a park and curled up on an empty bench, hugging herself for warmth. She thought of Mrs. Wilson, the only person who had ever shown her kindness. But what could she do? The Johnsons had made it clear. Jenna was nothing to them now. The wind howled and Jenna's body trembled. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the hunger, the cold, and the overwhelming sense of loss. But sleep never came. The night was filled with distant laughter from passing strangers, the sound of cars rushing by, and the occasional barking of stray dogs. She felt exposed, vulnerable. At one point a group of young men walked past. One of them noticed her and stopped. "Hey, look at this," he said, nudging his friend. "A homeless girl." Jenna's body tensed. They walked closer, their eyes filled with amusement. "What's your story, sweetheart?" one of them asked. "Need a place to stay? We can help." Jenna jumped up and ran. She didn't stop until she was far away from the park, gasping for breath. She couldn't live like this. The next morning, Jenna forced herself to push forward. She had to find work. Any work. She walked through the marketplace looking for job postings or signs for help. She stopped at small restaurants, cleaning services, even grocery stores, but every time she asked, the answer was the same. "We're not hiring. Do you have experience? We need someone with proper references." Jenna's frustration grew. How could she get a job if no one gave her a chance? Just as she was about to give up, she heard a familiar voice. "Jenna?" She turned and saw Mrs. Wilson. Tears instantly filled Jenna's eyes. "Mrs. Wilson." The older woman rushed toward her, worry in her gaze. "My dear, what happened to you? Where have you been?" Jenna broke down. She told Mrs. Wilson everything. The night she spent on the streets, the hunger, the fear. Mrs. Wilson shook her head. "That family is cruel," she said bitterly. "I wish I could do more for you." Jenna wiped her eyes. "I just need a job. Please, if you know of anything, help me." Mrs. Wilson hesitated, then nodded. "There's a foreign company, Liaoling Group. They're a big construction company and I heard they're looking for cleaners. It won't pay much, but at least it's a start." Jenna's heart swelled with hope. "Where is it?" Mrs. Wilson gave her the address and even lent her some money for food. "Go there first thing in the morning," she said. "And be strong, Jenna. You deserve better than what the Johnsons did to you." Jenna hugged her tightly. For the first time since being thrown out, she felt a spark of hope. The next day Jenna arrived at Liaoling Group. The building was massive, with glass windows that reflected the bright morning sun. It was nothing like the Johnson mansion, but it looked powerful. She hesitated before stepping inside. A receptionist looked up and frowned. "Can I help you?" Jenna swallowed her nerves. I heard you're hiring cleaners. I'd like to apply." The receptionist studied her for a moment, then handed her a form. "Fill this out." Jenna's hands trembled as she wrote her name. She had never filled out an application before, but she did her best. After what felt like forever, she was called into an office. A man in a business suit looked at her application, then at her. "You have no experience in cleaning for companies?" Jenna shook her head. "No, sir, but I worked as a maid for years. I can clean, I can work hard. Please give me a chance." The man stared at her for a moment before sighing. "All right. You start tomorrow. Report at 6 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Jenna's eyes widened. "I got the job." The man nodded. Jenna could barely hold back her tears. He had a job. A real job. It wasn't much, but it was a new beginning. And she would make the most of it. Jenna woke up before dawn, her heart pounding with both excitement and nervousness. She had spent the night in a small, cheap motel using the money Mrs. Wilson had given her. It wasn't much, but at least she had a roof over her head. Now, as she put on the plain uniform given to her, she whispered to herself, "This is my fresh start. I won't waste it." At exactly 6 a.m. she arrived at Liaoling Group. The massive glass building towered above her like a symbol of power and success. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The cleaning supervisor, Mr. Harris, was a strict man with sharp eyes. "You're the new one?" he asked, looking Jenna up and down. "Yes, sir," she said quickly. "Good. There's no room for laziness here. You clean the hallways, restrooms, and employee lounges. Work fast, don't complain, and stay out of the way of the executives. Understood?" Jenna nodded. "Yes, sir." He handed her a mop and a bucket. "Get to work." Jenna threw herself into cleaning. She scrubbed floors until her arms ached, wiped windows until they shone, and carried heavy trash bags without stopping. Every time she felt tired, she reminded herself, "This is better than being on the streets. This is better than being a maid at the Johnsons." But not everyone was kind. Some employees ignored her completely. Others whispered about her, laughing when she walked by. She looked so poor. Probably desperate for money. Did they pick her up from the streets? Jenna pretended not to hear. She kept working, refusing to let their words break her. By lunchtime her back ached and her hands were sore, but she forced herself to keep going. And that was when he arrived. The air in the office suddenly changed. People started whispering excitedly. Some straightened their clothes, while others peeked out of their offices with curiosity. Jenna looked up, confused. Then she saw him. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, surrounded by assistants. His dark eyes scanned the room, and his sharp jawline gave him a look of authority. He moved with the confidence of someone who owned the entire world. Jenna didn't know who he was, but the employees did. "It's Hyan Wu, the CEO's son? He's taking over the company soon." Jenna quickly looked away. Stay invisible. Stay out of trouble. That had always been her rule. But just as she turned, her bucket of water slipped. She gasped as it tipped over, spilling water all over the polished floor, right in front of Hyan Wu. The entire room fell silent. Jenna's heart stopped. Hyan Wu halted, looking down at the mess. Jenna's hands trembled as she quickly grabbed a mop, her face burning with shame. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her voice shaking. I'll clean it up right away." She expected him to be angry. To yell at her, maybe even fire her. But instead he just watched her. There was no disgust in his eyes, no irritation, only curiosity. "What's your name?" he asked. Jenna froze. The entire office was staring at them now. Why was he talking to her? She swallowed hard. "Jenna, sir." He nodded, then simply walked away, leaving her stunned. Why was he watching her? After that, things changed. Hyan Wu started coming to the office more often. And every time he did, he always seemed to notice Jenna. At first she thought it was just a coincidence. But then she realized he was watching her. One day she was wiping down a table in the employee lounge when she felt his presence. "You work hard," he said, making her jump. She turned to see him standing behind her, his gaze unreadable. I try my best, sir," she said quickly. Hyan Wu tilted his head. "Where did you work before this?" Jenna hesitated. She didn't want to talk about the Johnsons. "Just as a housemaid, sir." He didn't push for more details, but the way he looked at her made her feel exposed. As if he could see right through her. Over the next few weeks, Hyun-woo kept appearing wherever she was. When she cleaned the hallways, he was there. When she organized the supply room, he walked past. Even in the break room, she caught him glancing at her. Jenna didn't understand why. Why was the son of a billionaire paying attention to a mere cleaner? She started avoiding him. She made sure to work in areas where he wasn't expected to be. He hid. But Hyun-woo was patient. One day as she finished mopping a quiet hallway, she turned, only to find him standing right behind her. She gasped, nearly dropping the mop. Sir. Why are you avoiding me?" he asked directly. Jenna's heart pounded. I'm not. I don't want to cause any trouble. Hyun-woo's lips twitched slightly as if amused. Are you afraid of me? Jenna swallowed. No, sir. But she was. Not because he was dangerous, but because she didn't understand him. Why was he interested in her? What did he want? And most importantly, what would happen if she let him into her life? 4 days, Jenna did everything she could to avoid Hyun-woo. She stuck to areas of the building where he wasn't likely to be, kept her head down and worked even harder than before. She reminded herself constantly he was not her savior. She had learned the hard way not to trust rich people. The Johnsons had taken everything from her, and she would never let herself fall into another trap. But no matter how much she tried to stay out of his way, Hyun-woo kept noticing her. At first, it was just his eyes following her as she worked. Then it was small conversations when no one else was around. You're a hard worker, he said one day as she wiped down a table in the employee lounge. Jenna straightened. I try my best, sir. Do you enjoy it here? She hesitated. Yes. It wasn't entirely a lie. Working at Liaoling Group was far better than the Johnsons' house. Here at least she was paid. Here at least she had some dignity. But it wasn't an easy life. She barely made enough to pay for a bed in a cheap motel. Some nights she went to sleep hungry because she couldn't afford 3 meals a day. And she had no friends, only a few workers who were kind enough to nod at her when she passed. Hyun-woo didn't press for more details, but Jenna could tell he saw through her. And that scared her. One evening as her shift was ending, a security guard approached her. Mr. Hyun-woo wants to see you in his office. Jenna's heart skipped a beat. She wiped her sweaty palms on her uniform and made her way to the top floor of the building. It was a place she had never been before, where the real power of Liaoling Group resided. The hallways were silent, the air filled with a faint scent of expensive cologne and polished wood. When she reached his office, she hesitated before knocking. Come in, his voice came from inside. She stepped through the large doors, feeling even smaller in the grand space. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the entire city below, and rich leather chairs made the place look more like a king's chamber than a workspace. Hyun-woo sat behind his desk, his dark eyes locking onto her. You're avoiding me, he said, his voice calm yet firm. Jenna's fingers curled into her palms. I'm not trying to, sir. He raised an eyebrow. He swallowed. I just don't want to cause trouble. You're the heir to this company. I'm just a cleaner. His jaw tightened and for a moment he didn't say anything. Then he leaned forward. Do you always run away from people who try to help you? Jenna froze. Help me, she repeated. He nodded. I know you don't have a home. I know you barely eat enough. And I know you're too proud to ask for help. Jenna's throat tightened. How did he know? I can offer you something better, he continued. A safer place to stay. A chance to start fresh. Jenna's chest ached. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to let go of her struggles to finally feel safe. But she couldn't. She had trusted rich people before and they had destroyed her. She shook her head. I don't need charity. His gaze darkened. It's not charity. Then what is it? She challenged. For a moment he was silent. Then he stood and walked toward her, his expression unreadable. I don't know yet, he admitted. But I want to find out. Jenna felt trapped between fear and something else. Something dangerous. She shook her head. I can't, sir. We live in different worlds. His smirk faded. Are you sure about that? Jenna forced herself to walk away before she could second-guess herself. But deep down she knew, this wasn't over. Jenna didn't sleep much that night. She tossed and turned in her tiny motel bed, thinking about Hyun-woo's words. He was offering her something no one ever had. A chance to be more than just a struggling maid. But why? What did he want from her? Her instincts screamed at her to stay away. But fate had other plans. That night, as she walked back to her motel after a long shift, she sensed something strange. The streets were too quiet. She glanced over her shoulder and saw two figures following her. Her stomach dropped. She quickened her pace, her heart pounding. The men behind her did the same. She turned a corner, hoping to lose them, but suddenly, a rough hand grabbed her arm. She gasped, struggling. "Let go of me." Two men stood before her, their faces cold and dangerous. "Come on, sweetheart," one of them sneered. "We just want to talk." Jenna's blood ran cold. She yanked her arm, trying to break free, but they were too strong. Then, a loud voice cut through the night. "Let her go." Jenna turned, her breath catching. Hyun-woo. He stood a few feet away, his sharp eyes burning with anger. Two of his bodyguards flanked him, their presence commanding. The men hesitated. "Do you know who I am?" Hyun-woo's voice was deadly calm. The attackers froze, their bravado disappearing instantly. Without another word, they let go of Jenna and bolted into the night. Jenna stumbled back, her breath ragged. Before she could fall, strong arms caught her. "You're safe now," Hyun-woo murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle. Jenna gripped his sleeve, her body shaking. She had been seconds away from something terrible. And once again he had saved her. That night, Hyun-woo didn't let her go back to the motel. Instead, he brought her to a private apartment, one of many that belonged to his company. It was smaller than his mansion, but to Jenna, it felt like a castle. She sat on the couch, still shaken. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. Hyun-woo sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "Because I want to." Jenna's lips trembled. "I don't understand you, sir." A small smile touched his lips. "Then stop running and figure me out." Jenna swallowed hard. This man was dangerous. But not in the way she had first feared. He was dangerous because he made her feel things she wasn't ready to feel. And worse, she wasn't sure if she could resist him anymore. Jenna sat in the unfamiliar warmth of the private apartment, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. Everything felt too much, too sudden. Just hours ago she had been walking home like any other night, exhausted, hungry, and uncertain of what tomorrow would bring. Now she was here. Safe. But safety, she had learned, often came with a price. She turned to Hyun-woo, who sat across from her, watching her with those deep, unreadable eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back, studying her as if trying to find the right words. "Because I can," he finally said. "Because you don't deserve to live the way you do." Jenna's fingers curled into her lap. "I don't want pity." "It's not pity." His voice was firm. "It's a choice. I want to help you." Jenna wanted to believe him. But the scars from her past screamed at her to be careful. The last time she had trusted a rich family, they had destroyed her. But then again, Hyun-woo was different, wasn't he? Jenna stayed that night. Not because she fully trusted him, but because she was too shaken to walk out into the streets again. The next morning she expected him to tell her to leave. Maybe he had only saved her out of impulse, and now that the moment was over, he would go back to his world, leaving her alone in hers. But he didn't. Instead, he gave her a choice. "You can leave any time you want," he told her over breakfast. "Or you can stay here until you figure out your next step." Jenna hesitated. She had never been given a choice before. And so she stayed. Days turned into weeks. At first, she spent most of her time in the apartment, still unsure of her place in Hyun-woo's life. But he never made her feel like a burden. He never treated her as if she was beneath him. Instead, he invited her to talk. At first, their conversations were short, guarded. But then one night, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, Hyun-woo asked something she didn't expect. "Tell me about your past." Jenna hesitated. No one had ever asked before. But somehow, in the quiet night, under his patient gaze, she found herself telling him everything. She told him about her parents' death. She told him about the Johnsons, about how they had taken her in only to throw her out like garbage. She told him about Toby, the shame, the fear, the betrayal. By the time she finished, her hands were shaking. She waited for Hyun-woo to respond, to tell her that she should have fought harder, that she should have done something differently. But he didn't. Instead, he simply said, "They were fools to throw you away." Jenna looked up at him, her heart pounding. No one had ever said that to her before. For the first time in her life, Jenna felt like she had a future. But the past wasn't done with her yet. One evening, as she was walking home from a small market, she heard a voice that made her blood run cold. Well, well. Look who we have here. Jenna froze. She turned slowly, her stomach twisting as she saw Toby Johnson standing a few feet away, his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. She hadn't seen him since the day his family threw her out. She had hoped she would never see him again. I heard you were working for some big foreign company, Toby said, stepping closer. Looks like you've done well for yourself. Jenna swallowed hard. What do you want? Toby's smirk widened. I missed you, Jenna. I always knew you were special. His eyes darkened. It's a shame my parents never saw it. But I do. Jenna's heart pounded. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Toby reached out as if to touch her face, but before he could, a hand grabbed his wrist. Jenna gasped, stepping back as Hyen-woo appeared beside her, his grip on Toby's arm tight, his expression unreadable. I'd suggest you step away, Hyen-woo said coldly. Toby scoffed. Who are you? The man who will destroy you if you ever touch her again. The words sent a chill down Jenna's spine. For the first time, Toby looked uncertain. He glanced between them before finally jerking his arm away. This isn't over, he muttered before walking away. Jenna let out a shaky breath, her entire body trembling. She felt Hyen-woo's hands on her shoulders, steady and warm. Are you okay? She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something she couldn't describe. For the first time in a long time she felt safe. And it wasn't just because he had saved her. It was because he cared. That night, Jenna sat across from Hyen-woo in the dimly lit apartment, her emotions tangled. I don't understand you, she whispered. You're rich, powerful. You could have any woman in the world. Why are you wasting your time on me? Hyen-woo leaned forward, his eyes locked onto hers. Because you're the only one who looks at me like I'm a person, he said softly. Not an heir. Not a billionaire. Just a man. Jenna's breath hitched. You don't belong to the world of maids and servants, Jenna, he continued. You never did. And I won't let anyone make you feel like you do. Tears burned in her eyes. No one had ever fought for her like this. She had spent her whole life believing she wasn't worthy of love, respect, or kindness. But here was this man, this billionaire, looking at her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. And for the first time, she believed him. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. I'm scared, she admitted. Hyen-woo squeezed her hand gently. So am I. A small, shaky laugh escaped her lips. What now? He smiled. We figure it out. Together. And for the first time, Jenna let herself believe in a future that was hers to choose. A future where she was not just a poor maid who had been thrown out, but a woman who had been found by love.